Welcome to the Build Your Brave Career podcast, where we flip the script on the tired stereotype that women in and around the tech industry have to be stressed out, overworked, and underpaid. I'm Nicole Trick Steinbach, the International Bravery Coach and your host. Forget what you've been taught. Bravery is not a personality trait available only to the brash. Bravery is a skill, and you already have it. Which is great, because building the skill of bravery is the most powerful way to creating the career and life you really want. As you build your brave, you will stress less, work less, and then earn more. This podcast will help you do just that. Let's dive in. How do I actually use the Build Your Brave framework? I have to say, this is becoming, as more and more people listen to this podcast, come to my open enroll activities, invite me into their groups, learn about the Build Your Brave framework. This is becoming the most common question. And my answer is, well, you work with me. That's the most straightforward way. Or you listen to this podcast, and I still want to give a very concrete, present example that is impacting you as you listen to this podcast. The podcast has been renamed. So the original name was Celebrate Brave. The name now is Build Your Brave Career. And this shift is an example of me using the Build Your Brave framework. So I'm going to walk you through the multi-month process that led to the shift so that you can hear the gems and use them for your own growth. And at the end, I'm going to give you a few questions and a few ways to reflect on how you can use the Build Your Brave framework so that you stress less, you work less, and you earn more. Okay. So first, I'm going to start for context just to make sure that we are all on the same level. The Build Your Brave framework has 3 parts: clarity, momentum, and accountability. Each part has a corresponding intention written out as a sentence. For clarity, it is I set clear, specific goals and share them with the people around me. The outcome of clarity is your unique goal statement. For momentum, the sentence is, I spend just as much time feeling my way to success as I do working towards it. And the outcome is your implementation plan. Sometimes this is called an action plan. Accountability is I choose who I want to become and do the work to become her. And the outcome is your strategic growth plan. Now, there are images on my website, tricksteinbach.com. All of these 3 parts, they're overlapping circles. So some of the work done in clarity will be part of momentum and accountability. Accountability will feed into clarity and momentum. Momentum supports clarity and accountability. It's a perpetual cycle of support towards your goal, because your goal is in the middle of everything you undertake or I undertake utilizing the Build Your Brave framework. So for the renaming of this podcast, because the podcast has been in flight, because my business has been in flight, it started with accountability. I choose who I want to become and do the work to become her. It is deeply important to me that this podcast is of service to you. I originally started this podcast to share stories and insights to counterbalance the, quite frankly, old, outdated patriarchal advice that fills our spaces, as well as to minimize, to interrupt the loneliness that is often core to being a woman in STEM. That's why I started this podcast. But now, 150 episodes later, years later, the way that this podcast can be of service is different. The world has changed. The industries have changed. Tech itself has changed, and so have my core listeners. So in my effort, my strategic growth plan inside of accountability, there is this beautiful balance that happens as I become who I wish to be. And that balance has been listening to my community members. That's you, your feedback, your suggestions, your requests, listening to myself. This podcast, this is a cost line in my business. It is my act of service to our gorgeous community and best practices. And as I've been learning more and more about the best practices and more about myself as I do the work to become who I wish to be in this world, as well as your feedback, it was very clear to me that the implementation plan, the momentum of this podcast was out of whack, which took me back up into clarity. I needed to set clear goals, share those goals with the people around me, and explore what I really want to accomplish with this podcast and how. So as I was exploring the clarity, I reached out to experts in the podcasting space, not necessarily the experts who monetize the podcast with advertisements or the experts who are looking at millions of downloads per episode. That's not necessarily what I want to do. I want to have a thriving community that perpetuates support for each other. So I discovered the Podcast Marketing Academy. It's run by a gentleman named Jeremy Enns, who is well known in the podcasting experience. Now, as I was in the momentum towards clarity, I want to be clear. The name of the program is smart, but it doesn't quite capture what we do. And as Jeremy went into an audit, I believe the audit was an hour and 45 minutes of ways that I could improve this service to you. I got to reflect. I got to decide, do I agree with that feedback? If I agree with that feedback, is it helpful for my purpose and for the community that supports this podcast? I get to make decisions, and so do you. This is the first mark I want you to notice. Ask for expert advice as you craft your goal and as you craft your implementation plan. And that advice, even if it's the best advice out there, has to go through your accountability, who you want to become. Some of the things Jeremy said and that other experts said would probably make this podcast have more downloads, have more results, have more back and forth, but it would move away from who I want to become and who I serve. So that is how I started with accountability and how I started to step into momentum and started to step into clarity ever more. So again, you start to see how these pieces, these parts of the Build Your Brave framework support each other and overlap. The Build Your Brave framework, side note, requires maturity. It requires horizontal thinking. It requires curiosity and exploration, and yes, failure. Okay, so as I became ever more clear of who I wanted to be, as I was doing the work to become her, you can hear that certain actions were taking place, and I found myself getting more drawn towards clarity. Clarity for this podcast, but also for my business. And over many different conversations, over my evaluation framework, over my mindset work, over my actual survey of clients. So let me create context for that. I have a long survey that my clients for the past 2 years, so they may not be working with me anymore, they complete this long survey. And in exchange, I give them 2 free hours of coaching because it's a long survey. And as that data started to come back and we started to consolidate it and look at the insights in it, I realized that my goal felt uninspiring. It was time to reset the goal. So my new goal is to support 500 women to build the skill of bravery. That will be done in paid ways and unpaid ways, like this podcast. That will be done in person. That will be done virtually. It will be done on demand as well as in live sessions. Okay, so if it's 500 women building the skill of bravery, how does my podcast support that? And it became super clear to me based on Jeremy's audit, based on community conversation. So if you're listening to this right now, and I'm sure you are, thank you so much to the 5 of you that answered my call to give me feedback on the podcast, what was working, what wasn't working, the name, etc. Became very clear to me that women in tech cannot find my podcast. Celebrate Brave was bringing in adventurous people and wasn't quite nailing it with the career element, with the skill element, with the process of building the skill of bravery versus, and there's nothing wrong with this, but versus celebrating people who have already been brave. So I needed to change the name. And dear listener, this is the second pin I want to put in this. When I first thought of making this podcast, I was going to call it the Build Your Brave Career Podcast. But back then, and even honestly today, but especially back then, that felt like too big of a promise. I didn't believe that I was able to fulfill that promise to you. So I didn't allow myself to call it the Build Your Brave Career Podcast. It's okay. It is actually, I encourage you to take the 2% steps towards your goal. If I had waited for myself to build up the confidence to embrace Build Your Brave Career Podcast, we would not be at over 150 episodes or around 150 episodes because I would still be waiting. Want to know how I know that? Because I'm still very nervous about this name change, even though we're already through it. So what are you nervous about claiming? What are you unwilling to put into action right now? And how can you bring it down a notch, maybe even bring it down 2 or 3 notches and get started now to become who you want to be in your accountability? As soon as I was clear, so I know where I want to go, I know who I want to be, and now I have an actual goal, 500. I have an actual gap obstacle issue. Then I go into momentum. And this is where I spoke to even more people. So Michelle Mazur is an expert. She has a book called The 3-Word Rebellion, and she has a community of true experts running their companies with integrity and expertise, true expertise. I spoke to her. I spoke to the community in the Expert Up Club. I spoke to my dear, dear sister and community members who answered the call to give me feedback, as well as my clients. I listened to specific podcasts, for example, Grow the Show, How to Podcast, Podcast Excellence, et cetera, to listen to the best practices. And of course, I remained listening and learning and exchanging with people inside of the Podcast Marketing Academy. And then, dear listener, accountability, clarity, momentum. And then I did it. On one Saturday, was walking my dog, listening to a podcast, reflecting on what I really want. And I decided in that moment, okay, I've done all the research. I've done the discussions. I've set the goal. I know who I want to become. I know who I want to serve. I know how I want to serve them. I know what I want the name to be. Golly, yeah, let's go. And I came home and I told my family, I need a couple of hours. Yes, it was a Saturday. I need a couple of hours. Walked into my office area, sat down, redid the podcast cover art, redid the description, redid the intro and outro, and bam, it was live. It was live for me. It took another week or two for it to become live for the public world, but it was live. And I felt the feelings. I felt the nervousness. I felt the trepidation. I felt the excitement, what Glennon Doyle calls skited. And I did it. And now the work is in following up in the process and in the promise of a podcast called Build Your Brave Career. So this is an example of utilizing the Build Your Brave framework to step into the skill of bravery. Because calling this podcast, renaming this podcast, the Build Your Brave Career Podcast, I have less stress. Yes, there's a growth edge, but now I know where I'm growing towards. I have less work because people can actually find this darn podcast. They know when they listen to it that it's about a career. They read the description and they know, oh, this is for women in and around the tech industry to build the skill, what's that, of bravery for the career. I have to work less in explaining and creating the bridge, which quite frankly, based on feedback, I wasn't doing a great job of. And perhaps because it's always a lagging indicator, my business will earn more because it's clearer, because it's of more service, because there is less emotional and mental work for you, the listener, to make for the podcast to make sense for you. So now that you've listened to my example, I want to encourage you, this is the third pin, to think of one area of your career, and really one area. I renamed my podcast. Is it a big change? Yeah, it is. It is for my business. Is it a massive transformation from one moment to the next? No. It's been a process over time, probably about 9 months. What is one area of your career where you aren't currently clear on who you are becoming? And maybe it's even more of a granular question than that. Where's one area of your career where you're currently over emphasizing either best practices or what other people think or what your intuition is telling you? Because it's brave to balance and always be adjusting the balance of those three elements. So for example, and this is the most common, this is where I start with almost every single one of my clients. And also when I give speeches, when I join team meetings or organizational meetings, or I join a podcast, usually starts with stress. So if who you want to be is an imbalanced woman in and around tech, or perhaps it's just, I want to stress less, then here are some questions. Are you taking your lunch break? Why? Are you breaking up your day? Why? And P.S., if the answer to these questions are yes, still answer why. It's part of feeling your way into success. Are you attending meetings of value? Or are you attending every meeting you get invited to? Are you speaking up for visibility? Why? And here's the biggest one. I have an entire offering called the Accountability Triangle. It's on my website. It has a 20-minute video and a workbook to walk you through this, answering this question. And I trust you to answer it for yourself quickly, which is, are you doing your job and allowing other people to succeed or fail at their jobs? One of my clients recently said, I just feel like I have to mama everyone and I decided not to have kids. Are you being mama to your colleagues, to your manager, to your customers? Why? These are the questions that sit in between accountability and momentum. And as you answer them, using the Build Your Brave framework, because just answering these questions is brave. Let's be real. No one wants to admit that they're taking the lunch break because they hate their job. No one wants to admit that, yeah, they're doing 3 guys' jobs and the guys are still earning more and they're still getting promoted and they're still getting more visibility. Yeah. All right. It's so brave just to answer these questions. But answering these questions brings you to clarity, where you get to set your goal and then continue to build the skill of bravery. Now, I strongly believe that I answered the question I opened with. How do you actually use the Build Your Brave framework? And I want to hear from you. This podcast, as I mentioned, this is my act of service. What do you want to hear? What questions do you have? What guests do you want to hear from? What's working and what's not? My email is nicole@tricksteinbach.com. It's also in the show notes. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Build Your Brave Career podcast. I'm so glad that you're here, and let's make this podcast awesome together. Till next time, brave it up. If the Build Your Brave Career podcast is helping you flip the script in your own career, if it's helping you reduce your stress, work smarter, or create more income, please share this with a friend. Till next time, you are already brave. Now go build your brave.